Welcome to A Real Affliction, BPD, Culture, and Stigma, a podcast devoted to exploring how we experience, treat, write about, advocate for, and conceptualize borderline personality disorder. My name is Cynthia Gralla. I'm a writer and teacher with a history of BPD. Trigger warning. This episode will mention self-harm. We all know the structure and the beats of the typical health memoir. A person has symptoms, they get diagnosed, sometimes after much struggle to identify the malady. They do their best to get better, and they get better. It's a hopeful narrative predicated on the idea that illness and disability have clear trajectories and definitive endings. But for many of us, that is just not our experience. It hasn't been mine. Another problem is that these narratives are often packaged as tales of triumph that disenfranchise all those who didn't triumph over their cancer, their depression, or whatever. Some memoirists try to trouble that classic illness narrative, such as Anne Boyer in The Undying, her Pulitzer Prize-winning memoir about surviving breast cancer. So too Dr. Merri Lisa Jonson, author of Girl in Need of a Tourniquet, Memoir of a Borderline Personality, and professor at the University of South Carolina, upstate. In a 2014 article called Cripistemologies, co-authored with Robert McRuer, Dr. Jonson, who goes by Lisa, writes about the radical intent of that health memoir. Quote, Lisa had just finished her memoir, Girl in Need of a Tourniquet, a queer crip read, acclaiming and inhabiting of borderline personality, dropping the word disorder from the title to contest the pathologization of this disability identity. Formally inventive, the memoir sutured together many types of discourse: medical text, self-help books, fairy tale, personal email, autobiographical memory, to evoke a stuttering, self-interrupting flood of ways of telling her particular story, instead of adhering to one voice or paradigm of illness narrative. She too was thinking deeply about impairments not always legible in the disability rights movement or disability studies, even if the field was about to take what Robert has called elsewhere the mad turn, end quote. In her work as director of the Center for Women's and Gender Studies at the University of South Carolina Upstate, Lisa has established a critical disability studies certificate program. And much of her fascinating academic work over the past decade has centered on examining the concept of disabilities, including BPD, in new ways. Around the same time that she published Girl in Need of a Tourniquet, Lisa coined the term Cripistemologies, combining crip from crip theory and epistemologies, or ways of knowing. Thus, Cripistemologies question what we think we know about embodying pain, and how we know around and through pain. In a follow-up to that article, Lisa and Robert contemplate, quote, creative embodied interventions in ableist logics, end quote, by people like Sinead O'Connor, who lived with BPD. In this second and final part of my interview with Lisa, she and I discuss the form of her memoir, as well as her interest in diagnosing fictional characters with BPD, and the nexus of sexuality and BPD, which is both complicated and rife with possibilities. Maybe writers like Lisa can suture the diverse BPD community into one body of people who thrill with life and pulse with pain. In terms of the book, you play a lot with form in it, experimenting with typography, there's a lot of fragmentation, a lot of excerpts from the books you've been reading, memoirs and books about psychology, self-help. And I'm wondering, how did the subject matter, like in the experience of BPD, kind of inform these choices in the structure of the book? And also, as you've said, this was being written during a very stressful period in your life. So I imagine that might have played a role as well.
Yeah, so there are two pieces that I want to give you as an answer to that question. And the first one is a lot of the typographical play in the book is the result of the book designer's choices.
Oh, really? Interesting.
So a lot of times I'll see informal reviews that'll be like, and then she yells at things in all caps. But that I didn't actually do that when I wrote the
Oh,
book.
wow.
What I did do was set off certain words in small caps.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to address them as words. So like where
Right.
might see the words X, Y, and Z on the wall, I'm
Mm-hmm.
setting them off as words in small caps, but I think there's literally no small caps in the
Yeah.
book itself. There's a lot of full caps.
Right.
And I just didn't have, I tried to give feedback on that, but it was not openly received. I think that they were
Mm.
maybe possibly impatient with me. And I didn't have direct access to the book
Yeah.
designer. I wasn't able to talk about what I was doing. But there was the formal play that I did
Mm-hmm.
had to do again with just being such a voracious reader and just
Yeah.
loving women writers who are creative and innovative
Mm-hmm.
and fearless. And I had really fallen in love with the poems of Daphne Gottlieb, who is based in San Francisco. And she has this amazing style that she called suture poems. On one side of the page, it might be fragments from a news story. And then
Right.
on the other side of the page, it might be fragments of her own words. And so as you read across the page, it mixes their words with her words to create this multi-voiced effect.
Right.
And so that's kind of what I was doing,
Mm-hmm.
where I have other people's words interwoven throughout the memoir. The way that I heard it in my head was sort of like the editing, the collage kind of editing style that you might
Mm-hmm.
see in a film,
Right.
where it might go very quickly back and forth between, or it might even overlay some
Yeah.
audio on top of an image of something
Yeah.
that's happening. So I would hear in my head the fragments from textbooks
Yeah.
as a kind of stereotypical textbook voice of
Mm-hmm.
authority. It wasn't one, a lot of times I'll have students ask, were you being critical or kind of sarcastic toward that? I wasn't. I was
Right.
so grateful to find fragments of information that helped me make sense of what was going on. It was
Right.
not critical of them. It was more like, here's a scene where something completely intense and chaotic and out of control is happening. And then you cut in this voice of a psychiatric expert
Mm-hmm.
or an attachment theorist
Right.
who then says something that to me explains what I was doing.
Right.
So suturing them together, I loved that
Yeah.
because of the self-cutting aspect of BPD. It
Right.
seemed like formally cutting things together
Mm-hmm.
in a way that is expressive and productive and that makes
Yes.
something new out of the
Mm-hmm.
pieces, so that the cutting is more of a collage thing and less of a symptom, I guess.
Right. It becomes more of a positive act. And I was wondering about that, whether, because there is a lot of talk about cutting and self-harm, whether the formal elements were in line with that. So that's wonderful. And I know there are some trends recently about looking at self-harm in a different way, as for some people, kind of empowering. And I feel like the form goes along so well with that. And also with what you said earlier about the double consciousness we often
Yeah,
have,
I
that's
can
kind of like a
see what the problem
montage,
is. Yeah,
Right. So it's like your
exactly.
whole experience in your head is montage, like they're superimposition.
Right.
And I think that's so brilliant. It is kind of surprising about the typographical choices that were made without your consent. Although I know I had a book published by a major publisher in my 20s, and I was way too young and too intimidated
Yeah.
to ever really speak up about anything. To say any kind of dissent would have been difficult. Are you okay with the way it looks in
I
terms of?
am. I
Okay.
think that the designer did a good job. I think it's
Yeah.
interesting and there's a lot of beauty to it. What bothered me about it was I wanted consistency so that
Mm,
it would be very clear which
yeah.
words were mine and which words were other people's. That
Right.
felt important to me so that it looked
Yeah.
like a collage instead of plagiarism.
Right.
know,
Yeah.
as a professor, that was
Hmm.
important to me. And so there's very careful notes at the end that track all of the references.
Right.
But a lot of people don't read that part of the book. And so what I wanted was one font for my words and one
Hmm.
font for other people's words, and
Yeah.
for those to be interwoven.
Hmm.
That's not what they did. I do think it looks beautiful. I understand why those choices were made. I also do think that it made it possible for a lot of readers to think that all the words were mine, because
Hmm.
there's no clear tracking of that from page to page. And I've
Right.
seen occasionally quotes attributed to me that were other people's
Wow.
words, which
Hmm.
is again important to me. I was asked actually not to talk about it when that was happening, not to talk about it like on my social media for the book, because again, and I understand this from a business perspective, they didn't want
Yeah.
anything unfolding that would maybe push any readers away if there was like
Right.
friction between the author and the publisher.
Yeah.
And there mostly wasn't. I don't think I was right, and I'm not sure they were right. And I wish that there had been space for us to try to collaboratively find the
Hmm.
best solution.
Right.
But the fact that we didn't was almost 100% my fault, because I was so late with the book, because my life was so still
Right.
painful and chaotic.
Yeah.
So I can't blame them. I wanted the
Yeah.
book out on time, and I think that there's a lot to appreciate. I think that the designer was extremely talented and skilled,
Hmm.
and under a lot of time pressure.
Yeah.
And I think it's also even kind of interesting to think about her as a collaborator in the creative project. And that allows me to let go of some of the control
Hmm.
issues of what I think it should have looked like, or what might maybe go wrong because of how it's done. I think she did
Right.
things, she made some choices, and maybe it's not so much that I want to say anything critical about it, but rather just to bring her into the picture,
Right.
part of the creative team on the project.
Definitely. Like just like the book cover is such a key element for any
Beautiful.
book. And yeah,
Yeah.
yours is wonderful. This idea that if we can look at it as these
It's a
people being
collabor
exactly
just like,
co-creators.
watching a TV show, we hear actors
Hmm.
talking about it as a collaborative team project, and
Yeah.
it is. And that was the case here. We're just not
Yeah.
in the habit of talking about book cover designers and typographic
Right.
designers as part of the creative team, but they definitely were. And that art
Yeah.
on was original art that was created for the book,
Yeah.
and how special and amazing that is. So
Yeah.
I'm really grateful for the links that the publisher went to
Hmm.
make it a beautiful art object, because that's what I
It
really
is.
wanted, was to make something
Yeah.
that was beautiful, in addition to everything I wanted to do with the content. I wanted it to be
Right.
beautiful.
And it definitely is. I love all the different sources that you bring in, and I guess it doesn't even really occur to me that people don't look at the end matter. I love end matter notes,
I do
all those
too.
things. So, but I guess they might not. And that leads into something I wanted to ask you about, because I know that you do teach some literature as well as other things I imagine related to gender studies. And I really appreciated your discussing some pretty canonical texts in the book, like William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. I'm a big Faulkner fan. I once threw a Faulkner themed Halloween party during grad school. That was really fun. So I love those comments. You also talk about Bartleby the Scrivener by Melville. And I'm wondering, do you think that BPD has affected the way that you teach literature or approach it or read it,
So
or vice versa? You
yeah,
know.
so partly, one thing that I do like to do is to bring BPD into the picture as a possible explanation
Mhm.
for some elements of character and some elements of
Yeah.
conflict traditional literary professors and English departments have almost universally condemned the way that I do that. It's not considered valid way of reading literature. But I mean, if you look at the history of literary criticism, there are trends over time,
Yep,
and there have been
for
times
sure.
when people did certain things and moved
Mhm.
on from it. And now the attitude is, bringing in medical diagnoses or psychiatric diagnoses is not appropriate. There
Right.
are whole schools of literary theory that did that in a lot of different ways, that some were
Mhm.
interesting and some were totally impossible to even follow what the heck they were talking
Yeah.
about. And I like to at least think I don't have that problem in my analysis.
Right.
But I do like using it as a lens, and I am still
Mhm.
doing that and still writing, working on some academic writing that does that. I've decided if there are barriers to me moving up into other, institutions,
Mhm.
maybe the silver lining of that is that I can stop worrying about whether people think it's okay or not okay to do it, and just do it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
Um,
a huge silver lining.
Yeah, so that's the case, but I would also say, going back to the Faulkner and Melville and other authors that show up in obvious ways and in really obscure ways that
Mhm.
maybe no one even picks up on, or very few people. I think that this is not an expected answer to your question, but my nervousness
Mhm.
about expertise and authority, especially in my 20s, resulted in over preparing for class. So I started teaching at 21 in college.
Wow.
That's ridiculous.
Wow. Yeah, that's
And,
crazy young.
and so I was developing my expertise while standing in the authoritative role of the expert in the classroom, which
Right.
was really uncomfortable for me. Really
Yeah.
uncomfortable. And once you become an expert, like, it feels very different. I was
Mhm.
trying to cover up, I guess, all the work
Yeah.
going on behind the scenes to come across like an expert, and I was
Yeah.
overdoing it. So what that looked like when I had my first tenure track job, that would have been at age 30. What that looked like was spending all day Saturday prepping my Tuesday
Mhm.
classes and all day Sunday prepping my Thursday
Yeah.
classes. And although my dissertation was in American literature, I really felt like I was starting, and so much of my education was in that area, but I felt like I was starting from scratch, figuring out how to
Mhm.
teach a survey class and to become more well informed about the authors that I was teaching and to really know
Yeah.
the texts backwards and forwards. So if I was doing those all day Saturday and all day Sunday schedules over a period of 3 years in that job, that's a lot of Saturdays and Sundays. There's a lot of prep, and I would always reread anything I was about to teach. So I wouldn't rely on notes from a previous semester. So I'd reread the original, read some more secondary materials, and
Yeah.
polish them up. And so I became more sort of engaged by, and I was in the text, sort of turning the images over in
Mhm.
my head over and over again. And I didn't set out to write in the memoir, I didn't set out to bring that stuff in. It
Right.
just was there.
Yeah.
And it just kind of came to the
Mm.
surface as I was writing. And there were moments where I was laughing out loud, like writing about Bartleby the Scrivener, and kind of realizing, like, if you summarize it from a certain angle, it sounds like a lesbian one night stand gone wrong. And it just made me laugh. And
Right.
that's the pleasure of the creative
Mhm.
process. And when I
Yeah.
would sit back and think, does it really work? Yeah, it did. Like, I still was like, if you blur your eyes a little bit and
Mhm.
come at it from an angle that is not designed to produce the single authoritative reading of the story,
Right.
but is instead designed to sort of document the way that the story was working in my mind, I think it's a really solid reading, because it
Mhm.
it was through really thinking deeply about but like Bartleby the Scrivener specifically, that I was able to put into words that one of the big problems between me and Emily was that we were struggling to understand each other. Like it was just that simple and that human and that basic, that I couldn't tell if she meant what she said to me. I couldn't tell if I could place my trust in her. I couldn't tell if she was going to start a new life with me or if she was going to stay in the life that she was in. And I just thought that what I didn't want to do, because the first draft of the book was almost more like a diary of every fight we had. And when I turned that in, to my agent at the time, she was just like, this is so tedious. Like I can't, and other readers too, like I can't sit and listen to the story of every fight that you had. It's like sitting with someone who has this condition but is not making art from it. So then in the last maybe like 4 months where the book was overdue, it was kind of like an Elizabeth Wurtzel scene where she's holed up, in her publisher's office writing this book. I just tore it apart in this really kind of free association way, just ripped like 20 pages at a time, just out, threw them into another document and made it very sparse, and just started telling the story in a different voice entirely. You'd kind of have to know the story of Bartleby the Scrivener to get what I was saying and to get, I hope, why that's a funny comparison to make, but also how it takes you deeper into the problem in the story. And in fact, artists are not supposed to be their own literary critics explaining their work. I don't know why, because I think it's helpful. But in a way, like that's a perfect example of what I was trying to do with the book, to say what I'm experiencing feels extreme and it feels outside the picture of human experience, while my expression of it may be unusual to some. The problem that I was experiencing is a very common human experience of not being able to mobilize language and in ways that drew me closer to the person I loved. Instead, language and emotion were creating distance between us. And who hasn't experienced that? So I wanted to tell the BPD story as this specific, but I also wanted to recontextualize it and to say, like, but wait, we study and value and elevate stories like Bartleby the Scrivener that's taught over decades, over the ages. I was trying to sort of use a different example to make the same point in a class that I was teaching for Maymester about representations of BPD. In a culture that consistently marks it as a taboo and a terrible experience, but the same emotional states and behaviors comprise the stories of so many of the songs we sing along to on the radio while we're driving around the car. They're in the quality, special limited series television that we watch at night. You're telling me that what I have done and what I have felt is outside of normal human experience, but you consume those narratives all day, every day, because they speak something human in you. And why is it fair to draw this line around mad women or around borderline women as awful and with value if you can sing along to songs like I brought up Beyoncé, who I love, her wonderful song Hold Up, and the video, which I know is a commentary on Black cultural relations. So I'm not evacuating that part of the story, because that's what it is. That's the point of it. But it's also a story about a woman who was cheated on, who is enraged and poorly treated, and who is walking down a street with a baseball bat smashing the windows of cars.
Yeah.
And so my question about Beyoncé and my question about Bartleby are really the same question.
Right.
Why are you able to make relatable meaning from these stories?
Right.
But when they're marked as BPD or other
Mhm.
neurodivergence, especially for women,
Yes.
you clutch the pearls, push away,
Mhm.
mark as a risk to bring into your department, let's say,
Right.
too risky
Exactly.
to hire or
Yeah.
whatever. Maybe I'm oversimplifying things and conflating different contexts, like our entertainment contexts and our
Right.
everyday workaday lives. I recognize that, but I do think there's a thread you could follow that would allow both a validation of borderline difference and a fair assessment of sameness. Like, these are the painful laments of the human condition that we've read about in Faulkner,
Right.
read about in Thoreau, that we've read about in Melville. And as someone with degrees in literary interpretation, an English major over and over, again, that was the culture that I was immersed in. This is what I thought we were doing. We're grappling with the difficult, tangled, uncertain moments in our
Right.
human lives and
Yeah.
trying to illuminate them. Even though I say in the book is more mirror than lamp, I don't even
Yeah.
think that that's a fair statement about the book. I think
Mhm.
it's both. I think that I was quick then and am quick now to accept the idea that something harmful's happening, that I've done something bad and wrong and
Right.
limited. But I was illuminating experience with the story.
Right.
I was also talking about the parts that did not feel clear and did not feel manageable to me. But I felt like I was contributing my voice and my little piece of the fabric of, what I had been devoting a decade of my life at that point to studying and teaching these
Right.
heartfelt, raw, but artistically crafted narratives about the low, dark, lost moments, to just show them as they were. And then also, I think, yes, to shed some light on what might be going on there.
Wow, you said so much. That was amazing. It does lead into two questions I definitely wanted to ask. I really wanted to talk about women and sexuality, so I think that would be a good lead in. As you said, so much of canonical literature and prestige TV deals with similar subjects, but once we take this diagnosis of BPD and apply it to someone, particularly a woman, it has a very different valence to a lot of people. And you write in the book that madness is a word used to rope a woman's arms and legs to the bed, which is so powerful. I'm wondering, first, what is your perspective on the way our culture stereotypes women with BPD? Also, I know that you've written a few collections called Jane Sexes It Up, with different essays by people espousing sex positive feminism, which is definitely a circle I trafficked in, especially when I was in grad school in the Bay Area. And I find it so inspiring. Women with BPD are often hypersexualized. That's the image. And there are even memes about, oh, women with BPD are great in bed and all of that kind of discourse. But I'm wondering, is there a way that women with BPD could use sexuality to more healthfully experience their lives, their relationships? So what's your take on this image of women with BPD, and how can we reclaim it through sexuality?
I am aware of, and you may have encountered this too, the cultural conversations. Part of it's a joke, and part of it maybe isn't, about the hot crazy matrix.
Yes. Oh, yeah. And that whole article that I talk
Uh,
about it in an earlier episode, so I'll include a link to
oh,
that one.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I can't possibly know statistically what the relationship is between having BPD and being sexually uninhibited,
Right.
maybe someone who sets out to reject received knowledge about what you're supposed to do and what you're not
Mm,
supposed to do. I don't know what parts of that come from other forms of neurodivergence. I've been reading some
right.
interesting things about autistic women and
Mhm.
sexuality. recently about ways that a person might be performing a kind of openness to sexual experimentation as a kind of shortcut to a feeling of acceptance, while experiencing something more alienated internally, so that it may not be an expression of their actual feelings and desires.
Right.
So I think that that's out there. But in saying that, I don't want to suggest that all uninhibited stigma breaking women are having a contradictory internal experience. I think that that's probably not true either. But just to be aware, there's probably a lot of different things happening with a lot of different women. I think that it goes back to what I said about the way that being uninhibited can be marked as a symptom, but it is also a marker of bravery and a kind of openness to new experience. So I try, even with my own sort of at age 51, genuine surprise at some of the things that I took on, that I did, and I don't even mean sexually, I mean self-presentation, I mean certain spaces that I put myself in surprise me today, and would not be choices that I would make today. I try to be careful not to pathologize it as something that was another part of being in the throes of mental illness. It could be, I don't know, maybe it is, but also maybe it isn't. I think that it's complicated. I don't want to give the world another tool to pathologize women for any sexual choices. I think people make the choices they make in the moment based on a complex mixture of what they need, what they want, what they have the capacity to explore. But I do, in general, think being open to new experience is a positive trait, whether it's in the sexual arena or other areas. And I wouldn't say it's part of a personality disorder. If you look at the study of personality in general, there are all these different markers. Religiosity is one. Like, some people are naturally more sort of further on the spectrum of religiosity or further down on it. It's just a personality trait, and openness to experience is one of those markers. That said, I do think that it would be useful. It's a sparse sort of body of work, but I appreciate the material that has been written about the idea that we need some tweaks to sex ed. Of course, I live in a state where, I mean, I don't know that we have really anything to build on. But I love the conversation that neurodivergent women need a different kind of sex ed than all women need a different kind of sex ed than what we have. But we need
absolutely
neurodivergent specific elements to sex ed that would talk about things like vulnerability to using sex as a way to feel accepted, and might give this group of women that I would place myself squarely in this category a little more traction in their own experience, so that they might ask themselves, kind of, why am I doing this? Is it possible that I'm using this as a strategy that verifiably will not work? Or maybe we take a more sex positive and neurodivergent positive perspective and say, all right, so maybe neurodivergent women do use it that way, even as teens, and maybe that's okay. But if we would like to support that population, then we might talk about some of the emotional risks entailed. Okay, so maybe what you get out of it is a short-term feeling of relief from alienation. That's okay. That's an okay thing to do. But what I would want you to be prepared for, what I would want to be part of that curriculum, and I think it could be a curriculum, like I really do think there could be a specific curriculum around this. I would want to say, here's what happens when you are hugged or when you are in a kind of sexual embrace. Okay, here's what happens in terms of chemicals in your body. So I would want you to know about oxytocin. I would want you to know about something I did not learn about until early 30s, the parasympathetic system,
Mm-hmm.
because I was so confused. I would say to my therapist, I'm in this relationship and I don't like it, but when we go to bed and
Mm-hmm.
spoon, I feel this enormous sense of relief and belonging, which makes me think I should make it work. And she
Right.
said, how much do you know about the parasympathetic nervous system? And I was like, nothing. I don't know anything.
Right.
But if I had known about it, I think it would have given me a little more in my toolbox to evaluate staying or leaving or being serious in a relationship or not being serious in it. I think that that could be an interesting start to say, how do we support this group and meet your own goals without pushing it into a kind of conditioning around good or bad womanhood or losing your reputation, which was never, I mean, in high school, it felt like a threat, but in college, I thought, reputation with who? Instead of, I guess, talking about it as a character issue, I think maybe a kind of almost like utilitarian conversation about like, what are the pros and cons of using it this way? And how could we, or you, the neurodivergent woman, protect yourself from some of the confusion or pain that might occur afterwards, you know? So I would love to see like that totally different conversation happen. I also want to add a second piece to the answer. Although the stereotype of borderlines is these hot, dangerous women, that's not the whole story. So I don't know if you watched Baby Reindeer or not.
No.
Okay, well, doesn't mention BPD in it, but immediately after I watched it, I Googled Baby Reindeer and BPD, and people were already on it. The woman featured in this story surely has BPD, and it's based on a true story. So we've now seen the person who it is arguably based on interviewed in pretty high profile places about whether she did or didn't do the things that are represented in the show. Now, her name is Fiona Harvey. She would not be classified in the same category as someone like Glenn Close or other women that are stereotypically associated with BPD, those images that draw on the hot, crazy combination. She's portrayed as someone who is not desirable. Now, in saying that, I don't want to reinforce fat phobic narratives. I don't want to reinforce ableist narratives that underpin those categories, but she is in a different category that our culture has created that would be marked as not attractive. And in the story, she is someone who the main character is not interested in and is not attracted to. And in some ways, I'm kind of thinking this off the top of my head right now, and it's making me want to write about it. In some ways, like my immediate thought was, this is another Fatal Attraction story, and therefore not very culturally useful from an anti-ableist, pro-neurodivergent woman perspective. Now I'm thinking in some ways, it is kind of a challenging, maybe useful text because it moves away from that association between being really seductive and then dangerous because of these emotional and attachment issues. I have to think more about that though, because I think madness has been stereotyped as hot, but it's also been stereotyped as not hot.
And sometimes like there's the ageism in there too. Like sometimes older, women are the crazy ones. It's interesting when it comes to BPD because in the article by Sarah Maslin and her co-authors that responded to the hot crazy article and offered some guidelines for how researchers and journals should be talking about BPD. They said that the teacher of one of the people writing the articles had described people with BPD or women with BPD as attractive and thin. And yet eating disorders are very common, and including binge eating, and there is a fairly high rate of obesity. So again, not to play into any kind of stereotypes, but just the idea that they were described as thin when we know impulsive behavior is one of the criteria for BPD, and sometimes it can take that binge eating form. It's just strange. So it's not even really reflecting the reality. It's just the cultural image.
Yeah, I think that, what we're missing probably is that broad middle ground of lots of different kinds of women and lots of different kinds of men who experience these struggles. And it's just like that amazing book that Jonathan Metzel wrote about schizophrenia, The Protest Psychosis, where he maps historically how advertisements for medication or, treatment or other kinds of responses to schizophrenia changed over decades from being a white disease to being a Black man's disease.
Wow. Yeah.
The cultural representations are unlikely to tell us much about the experience.
The actual experience of it. Yeah. Even though everyone's experience is quite different, especially when it comes to.
It's going to be hot, not hot, plain, in between, thin by choice, thin by genetics, thin by illness. There's going to be middle-sized people and large-sized people. I mean, that's the hopeful thing to me about the sort of neurodivergent self-advocacy world on social media, that's the portal through which we're starting to see the many, many, many ways that a person might look while having a certain condition. Like I love all the work around autism and what you think it looks like. And there's sort of a theme that I've seen of that there is no look of autism. And I think maybe we in the BPD self-advocacy world could build on that and do something similar. There's no borderline look. There might be a certain population that is more likely to access treatment or more likely to garner media interest in terms of stories when they might have a meltdown that rises to the level of getting the attention of police or media. Which story are they going to pick? So it's upon us, I think, to widen that lens.